Hello, this is Ralph Alvarado, and welcome to Exploratory Text Analytics. Today we're going to go over the fundamental properties of text. We're going to unpack some of the ideas presented in Ricoeur's essay, The Model of the Text, that I asked you to read. In this essay, Ricoeur presents a theory of text that is meant to provide the foundation for the study of culture. And this is because text, for many societies, is a major vehicle of cultural memory. Our concern in this video is to summarize the fundamental features of text and to frame our analytical work using these fundamental features. We will present these as a series of assertions. The first is that text is not language. This follows from what I'll call Saussure's principle. Saussure is the linguist who in the early 19th century distinguished between langue and parole, or language and discourse. By discourse, or speech, Saussure was referring to what a person actually says, the words that are produced by the mouth, or through the pen, or through the typewriter, or through the terminal, that create discourse, create strings of words, create texts. Language, on the other hand, often referred to as grammar, is the system of rules that make discourse possible. The symbol that you see in the lower right is something that was used by Saussure to describe this relationship. He's showing that langue, or language, is generative of parole, or speech, and that the two are integrated in this larger concept of langage. It's important to note that in the French, langage and langue are a distinction that we do not make in English because both of those translate as language. On the left, you can see a concentric model of the relationship between langue and parole, where langue is conceived as a central core, or a kernel, that is finite and performs the role of both producing and consuming, that is to say, uttering and making sense of parole. And parole is the exterior, which we might imagine as kind of being unbounded, even though there's a boundary here. Parole is also, in this view, larger. Literally, if you were to measure langue and parole in terms of bytes, like if you were to try to describe the rules that langue consists of as a set of instructions, if you will, and then to encode also all the possible things that can be said, parole would be much larger than langue. Here are some properties that distinguish langue and parole that we're going to build on. The first is, as we've said, the words that we'll use to separate langue and parole are grammar and discourse. And let's look at the left side first, grammar. So grammar refers to what is called in linguistics competence, and this is most famously studied by Noam Chomsky, who is really almost exclusively focused on the study of language as grammar, language as competence, and articulating the finite set of rules, the system of rules that can be used to explain the indefinite and infinite number of patterns that one can generate while speaking. This system of rules is interesting because even though when we speak, we speak intentionally and we imagine ourselves to be in possession of this act in some way, it really is a collective and unconscious set of rules that we inherit. So none of us who speak English, for example, invented English. We inherit the capacity to speak English, and we generate sentences just like everyone else in our speech community. What's different about each of us is that we generate our individual patterns of speech that are very unique, that have their own style, and so forth. This opposition between grammar and discourse, between competence and performance, between finite rules and indefinite patterns, is often summarized as the opposition between structure and event. And in fact, that opposition between structure and event is really the basic concept underneath an entire school of thought which developed out of Saussure called structuralism. It argued that to study culture and to study the products of human culture, like language and fashion, almost anything you can imagine, cooking and so forth. To study those things, you have to distinguish between the event and structure and read the surface level of appearances as being evidence for some more fundamental level of rules that is the goal of structuralism to uncover. Now, the thing about language and speech, grammar and discourse, is that even though the scientific intent is to get to the former, to uncover and define the rules that generate discourse, it must be kept in mind that this is an abstraction and that it is latent. No one really ever observes grammar per se. There may be a time when we do, when we have such a good description of the brain at a neurological level, what's called the connectome, that we may be able to actually see mechanisms of language. But the current state of affairs is that this is entirely imagined, as it were, and inferred from what's on the right, which is the actual stuff that we see, the material text, the actual sound patterns of language that we observe. And so there's an interesting opposition here between the importance of the left and being the goal of the right being seen as data, but in reality, the right is the only thing we actually have before us. It's helpful at this point to go back to our categories that we talked about earlier about the location of exploratory text analytics within the wider field of computational approaches to the study of language. NLP is very closely associated with the grammatical side. Its goal is to try to build a grammar in order to have something that both generates discourse and understands it. Text mining, on the other hand, that entire school of thought, that set of practices, always had as its beginning the text itself without making a whole lot of assumptions about language per se, as understood in the first column. It always wanted to understand text as a statistical set of data that can be understood through understanding the frequency of the use of tokens and things like that. So it's an interesting opposition there that shows that this vision between grammar and discourse is real in the sense that we have developed computational methods that reflect that reality. So since text is a form of discourse, and discourse is contrasted with language, text is not language. But I do want to qualify that. This is in a technical use of the word language. The word language is often used to denote both language and speech, and we're not going to stick really exclusively to using the word language to refer to what was on the left-hand side there and to refer simply to grammar. We will try to qualify that distinction. For the most part, though, we'll try to think about discourse as what text is, and think about language as what linguistics is concerned with in the study of the generative principles of language. Second point, or second fundamental trait, discourse has its own linguistics. That is to say, the field of linguistics studies many things, and within that field there are specific ideas that pertain to the study of discourse. In particular, discourse has its own structure and function, which is distinct from the structural elements and the functional properties of other parts of language, such as phonemes and things like that. Structurally, discourse consists of sentences, paragraphs, dialogues, messages, things along those lines. And very importantly, the basic unit of discourse is the sentence. It's not the word, it's not the phoneme, it's the sentence. And functionally, discourse has psychological and sociological motivations and effects. The use of language, or discourse, and there I am slipping back to the use of language in this more broad meaning, the use of discourse is bound up with human behavior and therefore cannot be studied apart from it. And this is why the study of text is so important to the humanities and the human sciences, and why Ricoeur and Dilthey found their work on the study of text. Third trait, only sentences have meaning. The idea here is that sentences have meaning because they are constructions that assert something about something. Sentences imply or implicitly have the form, all sentences do at some level, they can be reduced to this according to the theory, that A is be, where is, called the copula in logic, is an intentional connecting of ideas. Words by themselves only have connotations and potential denotations or meanings in this sense. Words are on reserve, as it were, to be used and brought into play in uttering a sentence, but it's only in the act of uttering that a sentence gives words or assigns words specific meanings. It's only in a sentence that you can actually say, oh, that use of the word him refers to that particular person in this situation. Or that use of the word cat refers to that cat over there on the rug, as opposed to this general tool, as it were, in your toolbox that can perform various functions. This idea that the sentence is the unit of analysis in the study of discourse, and indeed in the study of logic, is attributed to the German logician Frege, who is one of the founders of modern logic, and quite frankly has a huge role to play in the history of computation, because it was Frege who got the ball rolling that eventually led Bertrand Russell and Whitehead to develop the Principia Mathematica, which laid out the logical foundation for what was later to be computer science and neural networks and things like that. So here Ricoeur, when describing the linguistics of the utterance, as it were, wants to talk about 4 specific traits of the utterance and of sentences as being part of the domain of the study of discourse. The first trait is that all utterances take place in a particular place and a particular time. They are creatures of the event, unlike langue or grammar, which is in a certain sense timeless and asynchronous. Discourse always happens at a place and a time. It's situated. And in the form of speech, it's ephemeral. Only when it's recorded, such as I'm doing now, through this microphone and this digital technology, or with writing, does it escape from the moment. But in its pure form, the utterance is part of the moment. It is an event. The second thing is that an utterance always has a speaker, someone who utters the sentence, who has an intention, who has some motivation and some meaning or intent in that sense. To send the message. And the flip side of that, which I'll jump to, it's listed as number 4, but I'll jump to it next, is the addressee, the person who is receiving the message. So the idea is that all sentences have a sender and a receiver, a subject and an object in that sense of the term. And finally, all sentences, by virtue of being part of an act and a moment of uttering at a time and place, are located in a situation. They're always embedded in some particular situation, which is what gives the sentence meaning. And situation here is broadly conceived to include like the physical environment within which one makes the utterance, but also sort of the shared mental world of the participants in the conversation. This is an interesting area in the study of linguistics that Ricoeur alludes to here, but we won't go further down at this point. Ricoeur further adds to this model the 4 traits. He overlays on this the 3 categories that come from speech act theory that are going to help us understand the difference between speech and writing. These 3 things are usually defined as the locution of the speech act, the illocution of the speech act, and the perlocution of the speech act. So the locution is simply the utterance itself, the propositional nature of the utterance, the fact that it has content. It's really what you think of when you think of that a sentence has meaning. The cat sat on the mat. You're thinking of the cat. You're thinking of the mat. You're thinking of what it is to sit. That's all part of the locution of a sentence. The illocution is something that motivates the use of that sentence in a context. Why did that person say that? What's the intent of saying that? What's the sentiment behind the use of a sentence in a particular setting? And corollary to that is what's called the perlocution, or the effect of the utterance on other people. Because we speak, according to speech act theory, which Ricoeur is building on, we speak to produce effects in the world. And sometimes there are certain kinds of sentences that actually have no references to things in the world, but simply produce effects. A famous one, these are called performative utterances. A famous one is, when a priest marries two people and pronounces them husband and wife. That is not, in an important sense, that's not an objective description of a state of affairs. It is a sentence that brings about a state of affairs. It is almost purely perlocutionary, according to the theory. It's important to understand that these dimensions, this particular overlay of speech act theory on the fundamental structure of the utterance, actually correspond to particular areas of interest within text analytics. So when you're talking about the illocutionary dimension of a sentence, you're really talking about what sentiment analysis is concerned with. So sentiment analysis is a kind of analysis that wants to uncover the emotional, motivational, sentimental quality associated with texts. A classic example is a company looking for whether their product is being evaluated positively or negatively in reviews across the internet. You do sentiment analysis to try to get at the motivations, the sentimental or intentions behind the people writing the reviews. Topic modeling and analytical techniques like that, which try to get at the content of a collection of documents, to summarize a collection of documents in terms of what these documents are talking about, is really focused on the locutionary aspect of the utterance. And finally, when you talk about perlocution, you're talking about something extra-linguistic that is produced by language, which could be a corollary analysis to your analytical work, where you're trying to find, for example, the impact of a set of advertisements on consumer behavior. So you would have maybe, some kind of topic modeling or some kind of content analysis and the features associated with that in your analysis, and then you would correlate that with an impact analysis of some kind, doing A/B testing to determine whether or not certain changes in the language used has an impact on behavior. So it's a neat way of helping to parcel out the sets of things we're interested in when we're doing text analysis. The fourth trait that I want to describe is that writing transforms discourse. And here I'm going to unpack this a little bit to make it clear. The idea is that writing and speech are two modes of discourse. So we have this notion of discourse, and we tend to think of discourse as speech, and then we tend to think of writing as the recording of speech. But Ricoeur makes an important point that yes, there is such a thing as the recording of speech, but there is also a practice that we're all familiar with, which is just writing, where you go directly to writing. You're not speaking and then recording it, you're just writing. And so writing itself has, it is something that is similar to and in some sense displaces speech. And it's an interesting kind of communication, because sometimes when we're writing, let's say we're writing a philosophical essay, it's a really interesting, question to determine who we're writing to. It's a completely different kind of discourse than sitting in a bar and talking to somebody about politics, right? When you write something down on paper and you're writing it, say, for the ages, as it were, what are you actually doing when you're writing? And that's what he wants to talk about. The effect of writing is to fix discourse in a way that speech does not. We talked about speech as being ephemeral. What writing does is it fixes discourse. It takes discourse out of its situation, which we've seen is fundamental to its definition. So what happens when we fix discourse, when we move it out of its situation? He argues that this process of fixing discourse has effects in each of the four traits we've looked at. And I'll summarize these quickly here. He does a great job of summarizing them in the text. The first is that whereas in speech, the event or the present is fleeting, and the only thing that remains from speaking is what people remember. And oftentimes what people remember is the emotional impact or the the pragmatic purpose of someone speaking. Rarely do people just remember, what is said verbatim. So what remains is a different kind of residue than what remains with writing. With writing, obviously, the text itself, discourse, remains. It is fixed. And we'll talk about this in a second, but one of the interesting effects of writing is because it is expected to be read and understood outside of its original context of being uttered, it has to encode verbally a lot of the things that are nonverbal in speech. So, for example, clearly the locutionary dimension of speech gets recorded in writing. That's the obvious part. The words themselves, the actual verbal part, gets written down. That's what writing is about. But the illocutionary stuff also gets encoded because there isn't body language present when one is reading a text. And so all of that stuff gets replaced by grammatical style, elaborate forms of punctuation, development of vocabulary. There's a great elaboration of the verbal code with writing that exists because it is no longer able to draw on the communicative resources available in the situation of speaking. And there's some other things in there that are in the text. Second level, when we talk about meaning and intention, so in the act of speech, someone's meaning, what a sentence means, and what someone intended to mean are pretty much the same question. As he points out, asking someone, what did you mean by that, is almost the same question as, what does that mean? Whereas in writing, those two things become separate. It becomes a real question of what did the author intend by this utterance or set of utterances versus what do these utterances actually say. We see this all the time in the interpreting of important texts. Classic example in the American setting is, interpreting the Constitution. What did the founding fathers really mean by this as a whole school of thought, strict constructivism, kind of a conservative view, versus what do these sentences possibly mean in this new context, a more loose constructionist view of the text. And that becomes a problem and a feature of what a text is when it is subject to writing. The third is that the world and situation in the Speech Act, the Situated Speech Act, overlap as well, just as meaning and intention do. And you have the possibility of what's called ostensive reference. I have as a resource, as a speaker, the ability to point to things or to assume that the speaker and listener share an understanding of things either immediately available or in our shared memory. But if we move a text out of the situation and remove it very far, we're talking about moving a text maybe hundreds of years from its situation or hundreds of miles from its situation of utterance across national and cultural boundaries, you no longer have the luxury of disambiguating text with reference by pointing to things or shared understanding. And instead what happens is in the interpretation of text, you start to discern a structure of possible meanings, and there's a whole, there are whole schools of thought in making sense of this. Structuralism is one, formalism is another. But this is an interesting thing to understand here that's going on both sides of the equation. It's not simply that the reader is in this quandary of trying to make sense of a text that has been distanced from its origin. It's that writers realize that there is a freedom to the text when it becomes detachable from its origin of locution and start to play with these dimensions of language and text. And many of our texts that we have before us are evidence of that. So there's, literature is a classic example of that phenomenon. And finally, speech is always, when it's situated, is always addressed to a person or a group, unless you sort of talking to yourself, in which case you're the addressee. You just don't talk to anyone in particular. I mean, there are examples you can think of, standing up in Hyde Park and just, blathering about some political point. But in general, it's addressed. Whereas in writing, and again, in this situation where there's a culture of writing and you're aware that your text is going to be distantiated, you're writing to anyone who can read. So again, getting to the case of writing a philosophical essay, you're writing, or a novel, say, you're writing not just to, the proverbial grandmother, you're writing to the world, you're writing to posterity, and that's a very interesting phenomenon. It's been called in the context of other media context collapse. So the way I like to think about this is that what texts are, they are fossils. They are just like fossils in the sense that they leave behind a kind of form and a whole set of meanings that can be inferred by archaeologists. And just as archaeologists are able to reconstruct facts about an organism from its bones or a society from its remains, so we can reconstruct worlds from texts. We can reconstruct them as through traditional methods of hermeneutics at the single text level, but in this course, we're working on the premise that we can reconstruct these worlds from at the aggregate level, looking at corpora of text using text analytic methods. And indeed, if you read the rest of the essay beyond what I asked you to read, Ricoeur argues that the archaeologist and other human scientists are really performing a kind of hermeneutics when they're interpreting things like material culture. I just give you another visual here. A text I like to think of is a kind of settlement pattern in archaeology. It is it's a distribution of marks on paper that were written, literally or figuratively by a stylus, and have a pattern that we can discern just as there were patterns left on the surface of the earth by members of a village by virtue of their engaging in commerce and warfare, or whatever activities they engage in and their living day-to-day lives. This is, in archaeology, this is called settlement pattern analysis. And you can actually, through studying these patterns, you can discern, the extent of a culture's trade networks. You can talk about political organization, lots of things like that, social organization and population movements. Finally, I want to say that the structure of text reflects the effects of fixation and distantiation. So I haven't really mentioned distantiation per se, and distantiation is a term that Ricoeur uses in other essays, but I'll mention it now. So we talked about fixation as fixing discourse in writing. So, discourse in oral form is ephemeral. It's sound patterns. They're gone with the wind after one has spoken, other than what's in memory, people's memories. But with writing, that gets fixed, and it gets fixed through written signs, through ink on paper, and so forth. The fixation of language with writing creates another phenomenon called distantiation, which is the removability of that document wherein discourse is fixed from that situation. And the farther that document moves from that original situation, the more distanced it is. And that's what we call distantiation. So we have examples of a high degree of distantiation between texts like the Mahabharata in the Hindu tradition or the Bible in the Christian tradition. These are texts that were, presumably uttered in the sense of written, but which in a context, and interestingly, these are meta texts that are compilations of things. But in any case, they are really quite distant from their original locutionary setting, and they are perfect examples of the effects of distantiation. So what are the effects of fixation and distantiation? So texts are materially encoded in documents, as we've seen, and they can be detached from their situation of utterances. So the thing is that when they are detached and they produce these effects that we just described, they kind of take on a life of their own, and interpretation, because of this, becomes a problem, and that's why hermeneutics exists. But at the production time, if you will, I've been referring to how there's a culture of writing that emerges when people realize that you can actually communicate through writing and through distantiation, and it doesn't have to be face to face. And this, by the way, we'll talk about later in this course, is what makes possible certain large-scale forms of political organization. What happens, though, in order to make that work, is that we have to develop cultures or language codes that are elaborate, that get very elaborate and develop explicit grammars, develop styles, Documents themselves, the actual material vehicles that we use to communicate, get very developed. They begin as scrolls and things like that, but then we develop books, and then books develop internal structures, chapters and paragraphs. We develop letters, we develop forms of record keeping, and we develop correlative with these individual developments at the documentary level. We develop things like libraries, which become, in a way, a new kind of situation within which making sense of texts is possible. So we're going to stop right there and just and point out that when we get to this point, when cultures get to this point of developing text and elaborating documents and so forth, documents get a structure, and there's a whole school of thought that's been developed to understand the structure of text that developed as text started to become digitized. It actually precedes that, of course, but what we're going to look at is the work of digital humanists when they were confronted with the necessity to digitize all of this work that had been accumulating over centuries, all of the development of documents and so forth over centuries, and to create digital collections. In order to do that, it's necessary to come up with a theory of text in a different sense to understand the structure of text.